Jazz is a century-old genre of music which has influenced countless musical styles in the US and around the world. It's a style of Black American music which has stood the test of time to become a respected art form through today. In popular culture and academia, jazz is usually thought of as purely a combination of European and Black American elements. But the history of culture is never that simple. In reality, some of the foundational rhythm of jazz came from Latin America, especially the Caribbean. You can hear the Latin influence on early jazz directly in the music if you know what to listen for. Though the Latin influence on early jazz is mostly unknown today, jazz musicians of the time were acutely aware of it. As Jelly Roll Morton, a jazz pioneer, recalled, "Then we had Spanish people there. I heard a lot of Spanish tunes. Now in one of my earliest tunes, New Orleans Blues, you can notice the Spanish tinge. In fact, if you can't manage to put tinges of Spanish in your tunes, you will never be able to get the right seasoning, I call it, for jazz." Jelly Roll Morton was a French Creole from New Orleans. He clearly understood how the multi-ethnic city he lived in influenced his music. A later jazz musician, Dizzy Gillespie, also referenced Latin rhythms in his autobiography. He said, "Very early, the tunes I wrote, like Pickin' the Cabbage, sounded Latin-oriented. Instinctively, I've always had that Latin feeling. Maybe I'm one of those African survivals that hung on after slavery among black people in South Carolina." Though Gillespie never lived in New Orleans and wasn't active until the 1930s, he was still aware of the Afro-Latin origin of these rhythms. Interestingly, that quote acknowledges that some Caribbean rhythm can itself be traced back to Africa. It's clear that Latin musical elements were a key part of early jazz, but it's not obvious how they got there. To understand why Latin music influenced Black American music at the turn of the century, we need to look at the history of New Orleans. New Orleans was under French or Spanish rule until the United States acquired it in the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Under U.S. rule, the city continued to trade with nearby Caribbean islands. As with the rest of the South, slavery gave the city a high black population. All of these factors combined to produce a unique cultural mix. During the Haitian Revolution in the 1790s, many mixed-race people fled Haiti for Cuba. 10 years later, war forced them to relocate to New Orleans. From 1800 to 1810, the city's population tripled from 8,000 to over 24,000. This migration was a huge source of Cuban cultural influence, culture which persisted through the 19th century and beyond. This mix of cultures and ethnicities was reflected in the musicians who worked in New Orleans through the turn of the century. These musicians included European Americans, Mexicans, African Americans, Native Americans, and French Creoles. Not only did the musicians come from a variety of backgrounds, they needed to play for a variety of audiences in their careers. Brass bands were prolific in turn-of-the-century New Orleans, and the material they played often drew from popular Cuban music styles. New Orleans' Latin influence didn't just come directly from the Caribbean. In fact, a significant amount of it came through Mexico. The Afro-Cuban habanera rhythm was popular in Mexico by the 1870s, and several Mexican bands were popular in New Orleans through the turn of the century. In addition to traveling musicians, large numbers of Mexicans lived in the French Quarter at the time. One musician who embodied the cultural mixing of New Orleans was Lorenzo Tio Jr. His father, a French Creole of color, was born in Mexico in 1867 before moving to New Orleans after childhood. Tio Sr. was a prominent composer for Creole marching bands. His son, Lorenzo Tio Jr., went on to play in Jelly Roll Morton's band. Uncovering the history of people like Tio Jr. helps to explain the cultural context Jelly Roll Morton drew from in early 20th century New Orleans. So what exactly are these Latin rhythms? There are many specific rhythmic patterns foundational to Cuban music, but I'll focus on two. The first is the tresillo, consisting of 3/8 notes, 3/8 notes, then 2/8 notes. This simple rhythm is extremely common in jazz and other styles of American music. You can hear it in the bass of Jelly Roll Morton's New Orleans Blues, the same piece he said had the Spanish tinge. The second rhythm I'll show is the son clave. This pattern is 2 bars long. The first bar contains a tresillo rhythm, and the second bar has on-beats answering that rhythm. The son clave can be heard in Dizzy Gillespie's Pickin' the Cabbage, which was also mentioned in an earlier quote. For another example of the son clave in early jazz, hear Duke Ellington's Scrunch. Before wrapping up, I should say that even this view of history is incomplete. The development of jazz in the early 20th century wasn't confined to New Orleans. Jazz finds origins in multiple places, and it quickly spread to other urban areas. It's impossible to have a truly complete picture, but any knowledge we can find helps our understanding. When talking about the media of today, it's easy to oversimplify their cultural origins. Though it's easy to create narratives about where a style came from or who owns it, it's harder to investigate the complicated truths behind where artistic ideas come from. Cultural events which seem straightforward on the surface usually are much more complicated in reality. If we believe and retell those simplified stories, we leave out people who contributed. Even when discussing recent history, it's hard to tell the full picture. It takes work to be true to what happened in the past, but it's worth it to understand the rich complexity that created the media we enjoy today.